was fired. I worked at a fast food restaurant that had goat arches. I did the fries, the shakes, I worked the counter. I had to take people's orders and give them out. So one day I came to work, ready to work on my shift, and I was told I was let go. The reason was I was short $9 in my register. And I had said someone had worked out of my register, the manager. I remember, and he said, when did it happen? And I said, Saturday night, between 7 and 8. Well, between those times, I had taken a break. But it was busy that night, and I came up, and I saw someone at my register. It didn't matter. They said, you're fired. So as I was walking out to my car, I was stunned, but not surprised, because at that point, the company or the restaurant had just been bought by another company. And what they were trying to do was get the old crew out and a new crew in. So I went home, and my mom said, why are you home? And I told her what happened, and my dad came home, and they told me, you can do nothing. It's over. You're fired. So a couple of days later, I got a phone call from a friend of mine, Scott Brown. Now, Scott and I worked together at McDonald's, or the fast food restaurant. And what happened was, he had been fired a few months before, but I had heard that he got unemployment insurance. So he asked me, what are you going to do? I said, nothing. He says, did they do anything by telling you or investigate that a manager worked out of your register? I said, no, it's been a few days, and they haven't called me or anything. But he says, you know what you should do? You should apply for unemployment. And I was thinking, I don't know. I don't know. And then he said, if that doesn't work, you can sue them. I said, sue this big company. Me, little guy, against the big company. So what I did was, I took what he said, and he came up with a game plan. He said, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get an application for unemployment, which I did. And he says, what's going to happen is you're going to be denied because the company is going to say this reason why you were fired. But you're going to get denied, which happened. Then he said, now you can sue them because now legally they have to tell why they fired you and the reason why. Fellow Toastmasters and honored guests, this one phone call from Scott Brown changed my life. Now I've stood up to bullies, I've messed up paper routes, and I've lost friends for thinking differently than they did. But this education that I got from Scott Brown has affected my life to this day. What happened was, I was thinking to myself, I've got to fight. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I've got to do it. So at the first hearing, what happened was, they didn't show up. They delayed it. But what I did was, in that fight, something happened. Because once you start to fight to get up, things trickle in. Not only were they firing crew members, but they were also firing managers. And this particular restaurant had a small office. So the majority of the managers had to take their work home. So this one manager took all the files home and copied them. And so I got a call from this manager, Pat. She said, would you like your contract? Because they gave us a contract that said what you could be fired for. And your register, being short, was one of them. So I got the contract from her, and I went to this hearing. They didn't show up, but I gave them the contract. Now, this is something, you're talking about a 19-year-old. This has never happened to me, taking on someone by myself. My parents were out of the picture. They said, if you're going to do this, you do it. And so, all of a sudden, I was so nervous that I was in college at this time. Tuition, bills, all those things I had. I got so nervous that I dropped out of school. And then I thought about it weeks later. I said, I'm a fool, because they had now controlled my life. All right? They were still doing what they were doing, but they controlled my life. And I was like, I'm going to fight this to the end. So the second hearing came up, and I had more information, times, dates, and all these things. And what happened was, either if they showed up, the hearing would go on. If they didn't, I would win. So thinking about Goliath, I said, these guys are going to be cowards, and they're not going to show up. So the day of the hearing, I waited, along with the caseworker, and they never showed up. So I won. And here's the actual decision right here. I got back in back pay $1,664. I thank Scott Brown for pushing me to the point to fight back. Now, I haven't seen Scott Brown for decades. And a couple of years ago, I read in the paper that he retired as a staff sergeant in the armed services. Now, it doesn't surprise me that he was a person who was going to motivate people, because he motivated me to act, to fight back, to keep fighting. And I'd like to give you a few ways. Maybe some of you haven't had to fight physically or mentally. But one thing I learned through this, and I still learn, even dealing with people in classes or even in business, is number one, make sure you have everything, all information. Make sure that you do your research. Number two, boundaries. What are the rules? What are all the rules? What are the boundaries of the company? What can they do and what they can't do? Make sure you know all that. And number three, make sure that you're going to take this to the end. That you're going to keep fighting the situation, whatever it is, to the very end. And that your opponent knows that too. The thing that you have to be aware of is that either you fight or you don't fight. And I'm always aware of that during times like that. It also brings up the thing of fighting without fighting. A few years ago, I got enlightened. I did something that I thought was kind of cool. I learned swordsmanship. And if you are in a situation where you are, that you have to use something, it is always good to know if you have to use it, you can. Now, fighting back doesn't, one of the things that you can do, you don't have to use a sword. You don't have to use a sword. But if you had to, the thing that I've learned, there's a series that I've learned from my classes, sword classes, is that someone walking behind you, can you feel them? What can you do? I've learned to evade. I've learned to disarm someone without even bringing out the sword. And that is one of the things that I've learned in fighting back. Sometimes you don't have to be physical. But if you had to be physical, I can. The story of the tea maker. The tea maker was in Japan. Very important person. But one time there was this tea maker that insulted a samurai. The samurai wanted retribution and told the tea maker to meet me the next day with a sword for a duel. We are going to settle this. Now the tea maker was terrified because if he didn't show up, his whole family would have the consequences. So what the tea maker did was he had gone to a sword school. He told them about the situation. They told him that what he would like to do is he would like to at least learn how to hold the sword properly. If he was to die, he wanted to hold the sword properly. So the swordmaster gave him the sword and found out right there that the tea maker was not going to be prepared for the samurai the next morning. So what he did was he asked him to perform a tea ceremony. Now, tea ceremony is a central force in Asian culture. It's very important because the tea is the heart of the ceremony. Anyone who participates in that, they will feel and taste the tea, all the flavor of it. Now the ceremony is important because it shows that a search for beauty in the world. And so what happened with that was that you have to have an atmosphere of serenity. All the hosts, all the participants have to be very serene for the harmony and tranquility. So the swordmaster saw the tea maker do this. And he said to him, the next morning, what you need to do is you need to go before dawn and perform the tea ceremony. So, what that will do is calm you down and you can face death. So the next morning, the tea maker did that. He went and he performed the tea ceremony. The samurai arrived, saw the tea maker, and he stood back, went sideways, and walked away. Now, the reason why the samurai walked away was that he saw him doing the ceremony, and he thought to himself, here is someone who is not afraid of dying, who has accepted his fate. And the moral of that story is, the opponent of the tea maker saw that not only was he to be respected, but not to be taken lightly. So the moral of my story, which could be your story if you've ever had or will have to go to deal with anyone, is to fight. Whether it's stepping off a cliff if you have to, defending someone, or even having your register short. That what you want to do is you want to make sure that you will take it to the limit. But most importantly, you want to make sure that your opponent knows that too. It's Toastmaster.